Hi, class. Today I want to give you all an overview of Chapter 8 in your Western Civilization Marvin Perry book. I'll be doing overviews of chapters 9 and 10 this week also. Now, as you all know, 111C is a Western Civ class, and in particular, 111C deals with what historians call the modern era in history. Now, the modern era really refers more to a mindset, a way of looking at the world, than it does to any sort of technology. Technology is an important thing as time goes on, but you really have to have a particular mindset before the real potential of technology can be reached. And what I want you all to understand is that the modern era is really important because it represents a significant breakaway from what came to be known as the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages. Actually, the Dark Ages are the first part of the Middle Ages. Then, once you get to about the year 1000 or so, you start getting into the Middle Ages. And then, once you get to the 14th century, at least in Italy, you're starting to move into the Renaissance. Well, the thing about the Middle Ages is that the Middle Ages were really defined by a lack of large-scale political units in the West, in Europe. Once the Empire of Charlemagne collapses, the Carolingian Empire collapses in the 9th century, you really don't have any large political units in Western and Central Europe. You have small states, and as a matter of fact, the most common type of political organization is what's known as feudalism, where you have a local lord who controls his territory, and the people who work on the land are serfs who do not own the land and who really are bound to the land legally, who provide services for the lord. Now, the other thing that's really significant about the Middle Ages was that religion really dominated life. Everything was pretty much oriented towards the afterlife. Everyday people, and this is especially true of everyday people. Now, I will say that people in positions of power, although they talked a lot about religion, I would argue that in most cases, religion was something that they used to help them maintain power. And I'm not saying they didn't believe in it, but they were in a position of power, and they knew that religion was something that could help them maintain power. So they did that. And so we see that the religious sphere of life was more important than the political sphere of life. And in particular, the church, and in Western Europe, we're talking about the Catholic Church, because basically by the year, really going back to the fall of the Roman Empire, Christianity in Europe was kind of split in two between Eastern Christianity and Western Christianity. And after 1054, there was a schism in which both churches had doctrinal differences, and so they were seen as separate churches. Even though there would be a crusade in which people in the West fought to try to protect Christianity in the East, there were fundamental theological differences, and so you did not have unity, in the Christian church. But in Western and Central Europe, the Catholic Church was the dominant church. And Catholic Church, literally means universal. The term Catholic means universal. And so what we see in the Renaissance and the Reformation is that we see a move away from this. Now, as the book mentions, the Renaissance begins in northern Italy. Now, northern Italy is very significant because in Italy in general, after the collapse of the Roman Empire, does not have a unified government. And really, you won't have a unified government in Italy again until 1861. It's not until 1861 that you have a country called Italy. Prior to that, Italy was a geographical expression for a peninsula in southwestern, south central Europe. And on the Italian peninsula, it was dominated by city-states. Now, of course, one of the significant city-states kind of in the middle of the peninsula was Rome. And that city-state was dominated by the Pope. The Pope, and this is the thing you have to understand, the Pope was a worldly ruler. You know, the Pope was the head of the church, but the Pope also was essentially a king of what was known as the Papal States. And so in Italy, the Pope was one of many rulers. And what we see in much of Catholic history is that the leadership of the church largely remained in the hands of Italian people. Now, Perry does not say this in the book, but I would argue the fact that the church was on the Italian peninsula, and the fact that the Pope was one of several, a couple of dozen political leaders with territory in the Italian peninsula, I would argue that it really created a mindset in which the Pope was simply not held in the same awe in Italy that the Pope was held in other parts of Europe that were further away. I mean, the popes came from local Italian families. Local Italian families maneuvered a lot of times to get people from their families in office. During certain periods in papal history, there were popes who had outside children because once you start getting into the Middle Ages, you have the whole tradition of celibacy in the priesthood developing, where priests are not allowed to marry. But what we see is that there are periods of time when you have popes who have children, and in some cases they don't particularly hide it. They say, "Hey, this is my kid," even though they're priests and they're not allowed to marry. And so I would argue the fact that the popes were Italian, they came from local Italian families, and the fact that people in Italy understood the humanity of the religious leadership in ways that people further away from Europe did not necessarily understand it, helped to encourage a more secular political atmosphere. I mean, that's not to say that people didn't believe, but they understood that these people in charge of the church were completely human, and quite often, had vices like anybody else, the same kind of shortcomings that anybody else would have. Now, the other thing that's really significant about Italy too is that capitalism, as we know it, develops in northern Italy. The Italian city-states like Venice, like Genoa, a number of other cities in Italy, these become significant commercial cities. They have significant banking, modern banking develops there. The concept of currency, paper money, which is something that originally develops in China, that gets to Italy, and people begin to use that. The idea of investment and paying interest, because throughout much of the Middle Ages, interest was what was referred to as usury, and was considered to be a sinful thing. That's one reason why Christians did not do it. Quite often, like for instance, if you look in literature, like this chapter mentions Shakespeare, like one of the famous plays of Shakespeare is A Merchant of Venice, in which a Jewish character named Shylock is a moneylender. And, one of the reasons why Jewish people ended up lending money is that Medieval Christianity saw lending money as a sinful thing. It was sinful to charge interest. And, this was not unique to Christianity. In Islam, traditionally, charging interest was seen as sinful too. And in Islam, in a lot of, even today, in a lot of Islamic banking systems, people find ways for banks to make money that don't involve interest. And so this attitude was not unique to Christianity. But as I said before, capitalism develops in these areas. And a lot of this just happens to be geographic. I mean, if you look on a map, Italy's on the northern shore of the Mediterranean. North Africa is on the southern shore. If you go to the east, you get to the Levant, you get to the Middle East, you get to what nowadays are the states of Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, modern day Israel, Jordan. And so Italy geographically was in a position where they did with Italian businessmen did business with people outside of Europe. I mean, if people were bringing in, like for instance, you had the Silk Road, which was an overland system that went from China through Central Asia, like the area of Afghanistan, which unfortunately has been in the news. People went through there and eventually got to the Middle East, which the eastern part of the Middle East is when you get to what is nowadays Iran, and would eventually, end up at Constantinople, modern day Istanbul, or over on or other parts on the Mediterranean coast, where Italian merchants would get goods and bring them back to Italy, and then eventually these goods would be distributed in other parts of Europe. And so capitalism developed in Italy. And what we see is that individual city-states develop what, Republican systems of government. Nobility, you had nobility there. But the notion that one had power simply because of birth tended to be less strong and was more tied to people's political skills, a family's political skills, leaders' political skills. And also they tend to have very, very strong economic roots. And so I would argue that you see secularism, and secularism is the idea that worldly matters would define things as opposed to spiritual matters. Secularism develops in this environment. I would argue, like I said before, going back to the fact that these people were familiar with the popes. They weren't in awe of the popes. They weren't in awe of the Holy See, which is another term for the papacy, in the way that people in other parts of Europe were. And also, we just don't see the feudal system there. We see capitalism developing, which weakened the feudal system. And so this really helped develop the groundwork for secularism and eventually humanism. Now, the final ingredient is that Italy, of course, was, several centuries earlier, 1,000 years earlier or 900 years earlier, was the heart of the Roman Empire. I mean, Rome itself was the capital of the Roman Empire. I mean, people in Italy every day saw Roman roads, they saw Roman aqueducts, they saw Roman ruins. And so these people were very much aware of the fact that hundreds of years before they lived, Italy was the center of a major empire. One of the first cities in the world to ever have a population in excess of 1 million people was ancient Rome. And they understood that this was that they were the descendants of this great tradition. And so it's not surprising that people in this environment were interested in bringing this up. Now, the other thing that's significant too is that, and I know I'm not posting a map here, but look in your book, look in chapter 8, you can see the maps. The other thing that's significant too is that geographically, Italy is very, very close to Greece. I mean, all you have to do is cross the Adriatic Sea, which is a very short trip. and you leave Italy and you're in Greece. And now the interesting thing is that, once you get to Greece, you're in Eastern Europe. And Greece is the part of Europe where the Orthodox Church, I mentioned earlier about the schism, that's the part of Europe that's controlled by the Orthodox Church. And by the time we get to the period of the Renaissance, much of Greece and the Balkan region of Europe is coming under the political control of the Ottoman Empire, the great Turkish Empire that would exist until World War I. And so, as your book mentions, you have a number of Greeks who escape or become refugees of the Ottoman Empire and move west to Italy. And so this means that you have a lot of Greek intellectuals, a lot of people who are steeped in traditional Greek learning, who come to Italy. And so what you see is that in this environment, Latin, which had continued to be spoken throughout the Middle Ages as a liturgical language, a religious language in church, and Greece, Greek, gets developed more. And as your book mentions, one of the first people to really push the study of Greek was the Italian intellectual Petrarch. Now, what we see is that, with this ancient, classical influence, people reading the Roman writers, people reading the Greek writers, we see a movement away from strict religious thinking. Because, your book mentions the religious tradition that developed during the Middle Ages, which was known as scholasticism. And scholasticism made use of the classical writers, but the overriding significance of the scholastic tradition was the idea of what people needed to do to get to heaven, the whole idea of salvation. And during Renaissance, we see people moving away from this and much more concerned about the secular world. Now, the most blatant example of this is the political writer Niccolo Machiavelli. Machiavelli writes the famous book, The Prince. And, basically, this is an advice book on how one should get and maintain political power. And it's very significant because Machiavelli takes absolutely no consideration of religious matters into account. And he's strictly thinking about what can a prince do to get power and keep power. That's the only thing he's worried about. He's not worried about going to heaven. He's not worried about spirituality. He's simply worried about power. And so we see a really different kind of political culture developing here. Now, the other thing that's really significant is artwork. And, what we see here is that people once again go back to classical traditions. And they learn how to paint much more accurately. And they learn the process of perspective. In other words, by using mathematical formulations, they're able to paint pictures that look three-dimensional. I mean, if you look at a lot of medieval paintings, there is no sense of distance. Everybody's kind of painted on top of each other. But if you look at the work of people like Leonardo da Vinci or Michelangelo or, Caravaggio, any of the great Renaissance painters, their paintings look almost like photographs. They look like depictions of three-dimensional objects. And so this represents a major technological breakthrough. Now, the interesting thing about the Renaissance, however, is that in Italy, as I mentioned earlier, the Renaissance is expressly secular. These people didn't suddenly become atheists, but they were not worried about religious matters and what they did. They were much more focused on the world. On the world. Now, but what we see is that as Renaissance notions go into Northern Europe, as they go into what nowadays would be Germany, as they go into Eastern Europe, as they go into France, as they go into Britain, as they go into what nowadays would be Belgium or the Netherlands, we see that people are much more interested in taking a lot of Renaissance notions of secularism, of humanism, and in particular, I guess with secularism probably is not the right word, but they're much more interested in taking classical education, and they're really interested in perfecting Christianity, because a lot of these people, they feel that Christianity as practiced in Europe is much more concerned about maintaining church bureaucracy, maintaining church power, than it is about spiritual matters. Now, at that level, they're not really that different from a lot of the attitudes in Italy. But I would argue that, unlike the Italians, who really are up close with the church in a way where they literally know the people in the church, they know the families of the popes, they know their business, so to speak, in a way that people in Northern Europe didn't know. And so they simply just did not hold the Pope in the same awe. I argue that Reformation, the pressure from Reformation was not as great. And when I say Reformation, I'm talking about the process of trying to change Christianity, which eventually results in the development of the Protestant churches. I would argue that the urge for Reformation is not as strong. It really is non-existent in Italy, because people are so familiar with the Pope, they're so familiar with the Catholic hierarchy, that they don't really kind of hold it to the same standard that people who are further away from the church hierarchy do. And so what we see with the Reformation is that you have people who start off like, say, for instance, Erasmus, who is from the Low Countries, the area of what nowadays would be Belgium. And, he's a guy who really, is critical of the church, but his goal is to reform the Catholic Church and, really, develop a more individualistic approach to Christianity. I mean, this is one of the things that you see in Northern Europe all the way around, is that you see people wanting to kind of cut out the church as a middleman. And these were people who wanted to have a better understanding of scriptures themselves. And so early on, you see people like Erasmus who really want to reform the church. But what we see is that people like Martin Luther, Martin Luther really becomes the first guy really significant out of Germany, who, really had profound issues with the church, because Martin Luther, like so many people, was very aware of his shortcomings as a human being. And he felt that, there was no way on earth he could ever really be good enough to earn salvation. Because the way the church talked about salvation at that time, they talked about good works. People needed to give money to the poor. They needed to try to help people. Basically, in addition to believing in the theology of Christianity, they really want people to kind of live up to the kind of Good Samaritan ideal that people see in the New Testament, of really being a decent, helpful person to people. And Martin Luther looked at this and said, well, I just don't think there's anything I can do that's good enough to overcome my sinful nature. And eventually, what Martin Luther realizes, the conclusion that he comes to, I guess that would be a more neutral way of saying it, because I'm not trying to pick sides here, is that he has the religious revelation that he can be saved through faith. That, it's not a question of him being a good guy or feeding X number of poor people or giving X amount of money to worthy causes, but that if he is a person of faith, then he can be saved. And so what we see is that once he comes to this belief, he becomes very firm in his criticism of certain aspects of the church. In particular, the thing that really sets him off is in 1517, and this is in your book on page 194, when he confronts a Dominican friar, a fellow by the name of, that's an order in the Catholic Church named John Tetzel, who is selling indulgences. Now, indulgences were something that the church, they said that if you paid for these indulgences, you could essentially pay the church and it would take care of sins you committed. In other words, if you had lust in your heart, if you were somebody and, you were looking at another person that you found attractive and you had all kind of not particularly religious thoughts about them. If you bought these indulgences, then the church would see to it that your sins were forgiven and, all those little naughty thoughts you had in your head, wouldn't send you to hell. Or if your neighbor really made you mad and you just imagine putting your foot in your neighbor's rear end, if you really didn't like them. And, that's a bad thought. And so, if you buy these indulgences, then you could catch a break for having this urge to plant your foot in your annoying neighbor's backside. And, I know I'm being a little bit silly here, but this is pretty much the notion of indulgences. The idea that you could pay money and the church would absolve your sin. And this is one of the things that the church, Catholic Church, would eventually get rid of. I mean, once you get to the period of the Counter-Reformation, you have people look at this and say, this really looks bad. We ought to get rid of this. But Martin Luther, in response to this particular friar, he posed 95 arguments, what he referred to as 95 theses. And so, no, he wasn't an MA student he didn't post 95 research papers he wrote. Basically, a thesis is a question. Like if the scientific method, you have a thesis, or the dialectical method where you have a thesis, antithesis, and a synthesis. A thesis is basically an idea or proposition that he put out, and he wrote 95. He posted 95 of these questions on the church in Wittenberg. And once he does this, he becomes a public figure. And eventually he starts a revolt. Initially he wants to reform the church, but eventually he breaks away and starts his own church. He starts the first Protestant church. Protestant literally means protesting, protesting the original church, which is the Catholic Church in Europe, the original church in Europe, the Catholic Church. And so Lutheranism becomes the first Protestant denomination. Now, the thing that's significant about Martin Luther is that Martin Luther understood politics. He had deep spiritual issues, but he was also pragmatic enough to understand that a church movement could not exist solely on people praying. He was pragmatic enough to realize that, although he believed in God, I'm sure he figured, the odds of lightning bolts coming down from the sky and blasting all of these idolaters, or not idolaters, but all these people who didn't agree with him, that wasn't very likely. And so he was able to work out political arrangements with local leaders. Like, for instance, on page 195, in the year 1520, he published Addressed to the Christian Nobility of the German Nation. Now, one of the things that's really not mentioned in this chapter, it's going to be mentioned later, is that by the time you get into the 15th and 16th century, you have the technology of printing. Printing was developed in Germany, in what nowadays is Germany, in the year 1444. And so this means that it was easy for people now, instead of, like for instance, during the Middle Ages, books were handwritten. And, that's a very, very labor-intensive practice. If you absolutely have nothing to do, Just take any of your books one day and decide to copy word for word a page from your book. And do it neatly enough that anybody can pick it up and read it. Now, I guarantee you, it's going to take you a long time to copy one page and make it look nice enough that somebody can go to a library and pick it up and read it. And so my point is that as long as people had to copy books by hand, this meant that only a few people would be able to read because everybody just simply could not get reading material. But because of printing, this meant that people like Martin Luther, later John Calvin in France and other folks, they could really get their ideas out. They could get a printing press, and all of a sudden, something that might have taken a person 6 months to copy by hand, you could put this, engrave this on a printing press, and then in a day or so you could have 500, 600, 1,000 copies out to people. Assuming you had enough ink and paper. And so this meant that ideas became more common. And also, ultimately, what happened too, because Martin Luther would be the first person to do this, is that this meant that the Bible in particular could be translated into local languages. And this was very significant because prior to this, the most common form of the Bible in Europe was what was known as the Vulgate, which was a Latin Bible. And Latin was no longer a spoken language, which meant that you had to go to special school to learn how to read the Bible. And only people of a certain level of education could read it. And so once you start having Bibles in German, once you start having them in English, once you start having them in Dutch or French or whatever, this means that people who were literate in the local language could read the Bible. And this meant now that a lot of people felt that, if they could get the Bible in a local language, they didn't need a priest necessarily telling them what was in the Bible. They could read it and figure it out themselves. And so that was another huge factor in pushing Protestantism. And so bottom line is that, like I say, Martin Luther puts out this book and puts out the letter, to German princes, arguing that they should go to his side in 1520. By 1521, the Holy Roman Emperor, the guy who kind of runs most of the German states, who is Catholic, moves against him. But ultimately, they have to accept that local rulers could pick whether or not their state would be Catholic or Lutheran. And so what this means is that in a number of places, most significantly in Britain, the political leadership realizes that it's now possible to break ties with the Catholic Church. And, very famously in England, Henry VIII, when he wants a son and he feels his wife can't get him one, because, back in those days, if a couple didn't have a son, it was always assumed that the issue was with the woman. Now, obviously, we know better now that, there are a lot of men who are infertile, either they're not producing sperm or they don't produce enough of it to make children. But, folks didn't know that. Back in those days, they actually thought that in each sperm there was what they called a homunculus, a little bitty miniature man. And, once that got into the woman, basically they thought the woman was just an oven. And, that the homunculus would grow into a baby. They had no idea about ovaries and all that kind of thing. And so therefore, Henry VIII, once his wife, who was a Spanish princess, he felt she could give him a baby, he wanted to divorce her. Now, the Pope didn't want to do this because, if he had done this, he would be offending the Spanish, who were one of his great supporters. And so he was unwilling to grant Henry VIII an annulment. And so Henry VIII goes to Parliament. He takes over the church. And he just kicks out the English church, takes their land from them, gives it to his supporters. And you now have the Church of England. And so what we see is that Europe really splits into Northern Europe, Northern and Western Europe, becomes Protestant. Southern Europe and Central Europe either stays Catholic, or the further east you go, stays Orthodox. And so really the upshot of the Reformation in Northern Europe is that it really sets in motion the movement towards stronger rulers and the breakup of the universal hold of the church and the movement towards nation states. Well, anyway, this is a long enough lecture. I'm going to leave it right here for you all. And like I say, I'll try to get out 2 more this week. Have a good day.